So you have a mixture in Genesis 3 of consequences that are natural and consequences that appear to be applied in some way. In other words, the exile from the garden is not something that just occurs naturally. The exile from the garden is something that God says, okay, we're going to put a guard here, we're going to move you over here, I'm going to stay over here. That seems to be applied in some sense, as is the childbirth pain and the thorns and the weeds that are expressed there. But fundamentally, Genesis 3 tells us that the original situation in the garden is seriously distorted. And from this time on in the Bible, you can speak in terms of problems and solutions. We noticed this when we took a look at James and Paul, how the Bible writers use different categories to discuss this. Sin, the human condition is described in terms of a problem. It could be a legal problem, a banking problem. It could be a relational problem. It could be described in different ways. And then there's a solution that uses metaphors from that same field. And so from Genesis 3 on, the human condition is clearly a problem that needs resolution, and therefore the salvation, the essentially salvation-orientedness of the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation. You can't do a hermeneutics of the Bible without talking about salvation, and that's why we've blended those two concepts in this class. So, in Genesis 4 through 11, you have the primeval history, and we're moving into the second part of this particular lecture video. The primeval history goes from Genesis 4 to 11, and it addresses what the world is like after the sin of Genesis 3. And there are three key themes here. First, that sin is an undoing of creation. And as you read your reading, you can see some of the details there. But in the original creation, God was separating and making distinct. He separated the waters above from the waters below. He separated the dry land from the sea. And in the flood, all those distinctions are destroyed. The rains come down, the floods come up, and the end result is the earth is covered with water, just like it was in the before the original creation. So the earth goes back to the condition it was in before creation. So the interesting part, and you wouldn't necessarily see this in the English language, but the interesting part of all this is that the language of the flood story, both its destruction and its renewal, is the language of creation. In the Hebrew, you have a variety of words that you could choose to use, and those words could take you a lot of different directions. In the flood story, the author deliberately uses the language of Genesis 1 and 2 to describe what is taking place in the flood and beyond. And you can see some of the detail in your reading, so I won't go into that here. But on page 21, let me just point that to you just for a moment. You see the greenish box toward the bottom. If you have page 21 of your reading, go get that now. And you can take a look at that chart, and you see on the chart parallels between the creation and the flood stories. And you'll notice that the language is quite similar. Waters covering the earth, a wind or spirit blowing over the waters. In the original, it's the same language, the same word in the Hebrew for spirit and for wind. So a wind hovering over the waters, a spirit blowing over the waters, really the same thing in the original. So you see the winds of the flood are parallels to the spirit of chapter 1. There's no distinction made in the Hebrew. Dry land appears, dominion, a renewal of creation, a renewal of the covenant. You see a lot of parallels, but you'll notice while there are parallels, not every detail is repeated. You see, God is consistent. And when God acts, there are certain patterns in his action because of that consistency. But God is not only consistent, he's unpredictable. And that means you cannot simply predict what he will do in the future based on what he did in the past. There'll be a pattern there, but exactly how that pattern works out will not be obvious until the situation actually occurs. So we should not become prophets, if you will, and say, well, God has always acted this way, so now he's going to act the same way in the future. God always rescued his people in the past, so he's going to rescue us now. Well, that didn't always work out when people reasoned that way in biblical times. So God is consistent, he's unpredictable, he doesn't have to carry out every detail of the pattern, and God is also creative in the sense that he can do things that weren't in the pattern. He can do new things. So there's a tension as we see the great actions of God through the Bible, and we'll see more of this, that you'll see a consistency of action, a pattern. You will see times when God doesn't carry out every detail of the pattern, and you'll see times when he does new things that can become part of the pattern for the future. All three of these take place. So, in the primeval history, sin is the undoing of creation, but God's grace restores the creation. So we see these two things going side by side. Sin pulling the human race downhill, and God's grace pulling the human race back. So this tension between problem and solution is illustrated right here in the stories of the primeval history that followed after the creation stories. A third thing that is important to this part of the story is the fact that there are two sides to God's judgment in all of these stories. God acts in judgment, but his judgment is not simply negative. You know, sometimes people think, well, judgment's negative. Judgment is scary. If I go into the judgment, I should be afraid. I should be worried about things, you see. So that's kind of an attitude we have. Judgment is negative, but that's not the way Jews looked at it. In biblical times, the judgment was a positive. A Jew who was coming into the final judgment was going to sue before God and win heavy damages. I mean, that's a good thing, you see. So judgment is not simply a negative in the Old Testament, but rather also a positive. And the two are blended together very often. For example, in the story of the fall, God banishes Adam and Eve from the garden. That's a negative judgment. But what else does he do? He gives them promises of a Redeemer, and he clothes them with skins so that they're not going to be cold in the world that they're being banished to. He takes care of them. Even in the judgment, there is a positive as well. So the judgment there is both positive and negative. Cain, negative judgment is obvious. He's sent away from the rest of his family. But where's the positive judgment? He's marked so that no one will kill him because of what he has done. God is protecting him even in his banishment. So there's a positive and a negative judgment, both working together in that story. Flood story, same thing. Negative judgment, destruction of the world, destruction of most of humanity. Positive, there's provision made for their salvation. Not one human being needs to be lost. They can all come into the ark if they will. And I imagine the ark would have been a lot bigger if that were needed. But God knew who he was dealing with. And he makes provision that no one needs to be lost, but leaves it up to them how they will respond to the judgment. So judgment in a real sense is not God arbitrarily saying, you know, this is good and that's bad and I'm going to punish this and so on. A judgment in a real sense is simply inviting people to make decisions and accept the consequences of those decisions. If you make this decision, these good things will happen. If you make that bad decision, you know, those bad things are going to happen. It's laid out before us, and we kind of have a choice. So that's how judgment is taking place here. Now, when you get to the end of the primeval history, you get to the Tower of Babel, and there you see God in judgment again. And the negative judgment is obvious. It is the scattering of the people, the confusing of their languages, and as all of this is taking place, They're suffering under that judgment of not being able to attain the full potential that they might have been able to attain, to build a tower that goes right up to heaven and challenge God and so forth. So they are limited by the judgment of God. But where's the positive side of that judgment? It's interesting that generally we wouldn't see it. And the reason we wouldn't see it is that as Westerners, most people today, I don't care if you're from Asia or Africa or where you're from, most people today have a considerable amount of Western thinking, which includes chronological thinking, that we're aware of the passage of time and we're aware that years and decades and centuries make a difference, you see. And so we would tend not to see the Abraham story as in any way related to the Tower of Babel, because by any accounting it was anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years after the time of the Tower of Babel. But in the Hebrew mind, that's not a big barrier, because the story in Genesis is intimately related. Genesis 12 is intimately related to what happened at the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. And I'd invite you to take a Bible and find Genesis 12 and read it together with me.